So hello everyone, welcome to the third edition of the Ferryfield and Bowes Quantitative Risk Virtual Summit. We're pleased to see so many professionals joining us today from different parts of the world and looking at the companies and job titles, multiple industries and disciplines, all with a similar focus and goal to understand and learn a bit more about quantitative risk and uncertainty. This summit is proudly hosted by both the Ferryfield Group and Bowes Software, two organisations that have been focused on this niche space for many decades now. My name is Craig Ferry, and I'm one of the directors here at the Ferryfield Group. The Ferryfield Group, in principle, is or are a team of quantitative risk experts, and have been working in this space for many decades now. Kind of ages us, but we've been doing it a long time. We advise, we train, consult, we implement, and we do a lot more, all focused in this QRA, QSRA space. We're also an integrated part of the Bowes team and really enjoying hosting these events and excited about the presentations today. Thank you to all the presenters. I know it's a lot of effort putting these presentations together. You're going to be meeting more of the Bowes Ferryfield team throughout the summit. Right now I just wanted to run through a few housekeeping tips, good to know items. So the session's being recorded. All the recordings will be each section will be separated and will be available on the respective websites and YouTube channels. If you ask when, we'll hope to get that done next week. After the event, post-event, you will receive an email with a link to get to that and instructions how you can access the recordings. Another thing is often asked, so if English isn't your first language or you prefer reading rather than listening, within Teams, there is a closed caption option, which we've dropped the instructions on how to get that into the chat. So if that interests you, you can go through and find those instructions. Throughout the summit, we really encourage you to post questions into the chat at all times, even when the presentation is happening. One of us will try and answer that at the end, and then we'll store up the questions, and at the end of the presentation, the presenters will be able to address anything that's either been saved or hasn't been answered. So yeah, please make it interactive. Please keep the questions coming. It makes for a much better few hours spent together. We're going to do a few polls throughout the session today. And the main reason for this is for us to try and get a better understanding of our audience and help shape future events and get to know you better just in general. So before I hand over to Aman Bajaj, who's the newest member of the Ferryfield team, we're going to try out our first poll, Gustavo. Didn't realize I had to do it myself before I get it off the screen. So anyway, well, thanks for that. Well, these results are going to be really useful going forward. We'll be able to collate these and get a better understanding of what everyone's interested in. So I'm going to now introduce Aman, just to talk briefly about himself, what he's going to be up to going forward with Bowes and Ferryfield. So over to you, Aman.
Thank you, Craig. Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Aman Bajaj. I'm based in London, and as Craig mentioned, I'm newest member of the Ferryfield team. I joined them last month. But overall, in the whole QRA and probabilistic modeling space, I've been doing this for over 12 years. So I started in 2012 at Palisade, where I had the exposure of supporting lots of organizations with Monte Carlo simulation with different use cases. It could be cost uncertainty, it could be schedule uncertainty, it could be financial modeling, even use cases in oil and gas and pharma and so on. So I have all that exposure. And as you know, Ferryfield is a consultancy founded by former Palisade engineers and risk practitioners. And what we're doing here is we're supporting teams with model reviews, training, building probabilistic models from scratch if needed with tools like Model Risk, Tamara, and so on. A lot of the work that I do is help clients and teams answer questions in the project space. So for example, if you're in projects, you may be asking, how much contingency do we really need for that next project? Or what confidence level do we have in the estimate that we have prepared at the tender stage? How exposed are we if the project delivery moves from P50 to the P80? What's that risk gap looking like? And more importantly, how do we explain risk to leadership, etc., and so on? So this is where I come in and help you support those kind of discussions and modeling in projects. So I'm really looking forward to all the discussions today and how others are applying, these practices in commercial decision making. So that's a quick intro from me. I will hand it over to Timur now.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. First of all, welcome and thank you for joining us today. It's really great to see so many people here, so many participants. When we planned this summit, we hoped that there would be interest, but it's still very nice to actually see it. So clearly there are quite a few people who care about quantitative methods and ways to make better decisions. At VOS Software, we've been working in this field for many years, over 20 years now. And one thing that we are noticing recently is the interest in quantitative methods is growing, which is really good. I think, many companies, organizations, they want to use approaches like Monte Carlo simulation, probabilistic modeling, and the biggest challenge is not always the tools, but it's the knowledge of how to apply those tools, how to how to know how to use those methods in practice, and how they can be applied in real situations. So we are very happy to support anything that helps make quantitative thinking more widespread. And I'd like to mention that we at VOS started a small initiative in this direction. So we launched a LinkedIn newsletter where we hoping to regularly publish practical use cases from different industries. And each issue focuses on a real problem, for example, in the project management or insurance or energy or other areas. And that shows how can quantitative methods be used in practice. And importantly, we also include a model that you can download and you can play with yourself, because reading about Monte Carlo simulation is one thing, listening to it is one thing, but opening a model, changing assumptions, running simulations, so that's when things can become really clear. If that sounds interesting, I definitely encourage you to subscribe to the newsletter on LinkedIn. At the same time, we are, of course, continuing to work on improving our tools, and the goal is simple: make the tools more powerful, more easy to use, more accessible. And we want, of course, more people to be able to apply quantitative methods without needing to be specialists. So if you have any comments or feedback on our tools, please don't forget to share them. And so we you can expect some interesting updates and news for us in the near future. And if you'd like to hear about those, subscribe to our VOS Software on LinkedIn channel. And finally, I would like to thank our partners at Fairfield for working with us on the summit. And of course, thank you to all of the participants who will be sharing their expertise today. I hope today will be interesting for you, useful, and maybe even inspiring. And with that, I'm handing over to my colleague, Jameson.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Craig, Aman, and Timur for those opening remarks. Now let's move to the first technical presentation of the day. Our first speaker is Francois Joubert, a practitioner in quantitative project risk analysis and cost modeling with extensive experience in large capital projects. This presentation is titled Using an Uncertainty Matrix to Determine Where Risk Sits in a Project. Francois will discuss situations where traditional tornado diagrams do not clearly show the drivers of uncertainty, and how uncertainty matrix approach can provide better insight to where contingency should be focused on within a project. This approach can help answer an important question for project teams. Where should we focus our attention when uncertainty is distributed across many elements? Francois, thank you for joining us today. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, and greetings. Let me share my screen with you. And there's my presentation. Can you all see it? Can you see the screen?
Looks good.
Cool. Good afternoon. I'm greeting you from South Africa, and I'm going to talk about what do you do where the risk sits if tornado graphs don't tell you the whole story. So we're going to introduction, and we talk a little bit about language and some of the terminology which I'm going to use. I'm going to go into an example regarding something which a client wanted and the model that I used. And I'm first going to talk about, if you do these types of models and it works the first time, I'll talk us through that case, and then I'll present the case where the tornado graph doesn't help. And then I'll show an answer on that, and then I'll have some concluding remarks and some questions at the end. Okay. So just my background, I am a project risk management specialist. I did a PhD in this field, and I'm sorry, but I still used at risk. And I also teach, and tomorrow I teach at University of Pretoria. I do risk management, and I want to thank for the master students in project management, and I want to thank the office staff and Goedele at Bose for helping me to give temporary licenses to all my students so that I can teach them there as well regarding the basics of quantitative risk assessments and the use of Tamara and model risk. Okay, my history with Bose is if you want to know I see the best book on quantitative risk analysis and how those models work. In my experience, it is the book of David Bose. I strongly recommend it if you want to know more about this and how those models work and sample models. And the book weighs 1.5 tons. It's really a useful book. And regarding my use of Tamara and model risk, I use it on a weekly basis. And I currently have 2 projects for which I need to build quantitative risk assessments for. And for me, the thing that I really like the most about the software is that it's easy to implement, easy to use. And I've never had one of my clients questioning the software and what the software produced. They question the models I built, but they never question how the software performs in terms of producing those models. Okay. Please note, I'm going to show you an example, an Excel example. It talks about project contingency. It's not tied into Tamara, and I didn't. You can do that; it's easily done, but I just kept those 2 things separately. And at the end of the presentation, I can to show if you apply a little bit of imagination, what you can do with the software. It also tells you about what you do if there is not an answer, but more than one answer. And also, then it's really important to use existing Excel functions to get to the answer or the model that I'm going to show you later on. You'll see extensive use of sum ifs and named ranges. It makes the life much easier if you build models. It's also easier to interpret the models as I go on. Okay. Assignment brief. I'm going to talk about a little bit about contingency. And I want to thank a colleague of mine who's in the meeting, Quentin. He introduced me to all the great standards and guidelines which are set out by ASCE. And we're going to talk here about contingency. Because the whole model that I'm going to present to you talks about the whole issue of contingency. There are on several models on YouTube where you can see how these models work in some detail. I'm not going to go into all the detail, but you will see you'll see a lot of similarities in terms of what's presented on YouTube, because this follows greatly on that. And I'm sure I'll miss things that that you want to know. So just put those questions in the chat box, and I'll start now with just contingency. And in ISO 31000 calls this risk finance, and it talks about how much money do I need to put in the project for risk. Okay, that's basically what it comes down to. On the screen, you see the ASCE definition. And it's important to note that contingency, there are things which contingency excludes. Major scope changes, extraordinary events such as natural disasters, things like management reserves. Sometimes also you see that people use Monte Carlo simulation to estimate management reserves and contingency using the same output distributions. And then also it excludes escalation and currency effects. I'm going to make 2 comments on this. I've seen cases where people use contingency to pay for scope changes. It's not a good idea. And the project I worked on where they did that specifically caused significant disputes between my client and the client. And then just on the last one, some learning for me from the last while. Specifically, you can have a very sophisticated integrated cost and schedule model for a project where you estimate contingency, and you can have a contingency of 17% or something like that, doesn't matter. But if your project will only be starting to be executed in 2030 or 2032, you have 6 or 7 years of escalation. And sometimes that escalation is the bigger risk that needs to be managed and understood in terms of the overall life cycle cost of the project. So please never underestimate the issue of escalation and time value of money when you deal with projects which are only be executed, for argument's sake, in 7 or 8 years' time. Just a lesson from my side in the last while. Okay, so. And this is the graph you see on the screen is from Broadleaf, and I use this because they explain it really well. You'll see later on as well, we're going to produce an output distribution, like you see on the graph there. You'll see a base cost, and then you see the difference between base cost and a certain confidence interval on the output distribution will be your contingency. And throughout this, I will be using for the sake of the example, I'll be using a P94 to explain the model. Okay, this is also a very nice paper by Broadleaf. They also describe in very simple language how the risk factor method works, and I'll be using the risk factor method extensively later on in the presentation. Then just on tornado graphs. So tornado graphs, you can read the description on the screen, but it comes down to tornado graphs show where changes to the input and changes to the output distributions are the closely related. I'm going to give you an example. If you have a small car with a small engine and you're driving up a big mountain and you put down your foot, very little happens. So that will be at the bottom of the tornado graph, because if you put your foot down, it's a big change, very little happens. But if you are driving up a mountain with a V12 Rolls-Royce, even if the car is heavy and you put your foot down, there's a big correlation in terms of what the car does in terms of you putting your foot down and how the car behaves. Those types of things in that type of context would be at the top of the tornado graph. So it talks about how changes to the inputs and outputs in a model are related to each other. Okay, and you'll see, we'll talk a little bit about that later on as well. Okay, so the assignment brief, what my client wanted, they have a bill of quantities. Now I'll show you later what I mean with that if you're not familiar with the term. And they wanted to have the P90 contingency of the project. Now, this is not a discussion on whether you use P70 or P80 or P90. This is just the, as we have in the example. They wanted to know where the uncertainty sits. They want to make decisions regarding contingency. And they also want to know, and I'm quoting here my friend Quinton, who sits in the meeting here, and I can't tell you how many times I've used this in terms to understand what quantitative risk assessment is about. It helps us to answer the question, what matters most and where do we need to focus on for now? And Quinton, thank you again for that. I'm using it again. I'm playing with your carves. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so the model. So for the project, we are in the concept phase, and I'll show you the Excel on later on. Just you talking through the principles in here. We have a bill of quantities where we have different packages. There are 5 packages in the work breakdown structure. You can see that column B. I always use a line number thing in here as well. It's easier to use the line number specifically if you need to sort things. Then I have a type column. We have direct and indirect cost, where the indirect cost talks about the EPCM and the owner's cost. Then I just have a cost item description. I have a base price, and I have a number of units, and I have a deterministic cost. Okay, so 60.93 times 7 gives me 426.53. And just please note, all the data here is fictional. It's just an example. I used random number generation to create the base units and the base price and the number of units. Okay, it's a simple bill of quantities with a total, and we're going to see also where that total sits on our output distribution on the histogram of the entire model. Okay. Now the thing is, when I build these models, I make extensive use of named ranges. It is just so much easier, and in this case, you'll see that there's a named range called deterministic cost. And there's also a named range called package, and you'll see deterministic cost will sit in column G, and column B will have the package description. And I would use a sum if I would say add up all the packages where the package is using the description there in the table, and using deterministic cost, that array as an input, as the total range. And then you get a very nice table which gives you an overview of where the cost sits in the project. I extensively use this in all the models I use, because it just makes it much easier. There's just one thing that's really important when you use these named ranges, and that is if you use from C3 to C102, and they're all like that, and there's a C101, the model will fall over. Okay, so just be careful of that. If you use named ranges, and all the ranges must have the same size, otherwise the model will fall over. Okay. Then the process which I followed is, now we used risk factors, and I'll show you now a little bit more about what that means. But it basically comes down to categorizing, using categories to define uncertainty on a line item basis in the bill of quantity. So, and I'll show you now on the next screen what the risk factors look like. But I have cost categories there, you can see in that column there, and then I have level of engineering. And how it works is that for the first line item, I put that item. The cost category is market pricing, and I have a high level of engineering. And based on that, I could then simulate what market price means and what high means, and I could then use that to get a price. So in this case, how this works, you'll see that it's 426.25 multiplied by 0.99 multiplied by 0.98 would give me 413.83 euro for that line item. That is basically how these types of models work. And I also, before somebody asked me regarding the issue of correlation, I assume for this model that there's no correlation between any of the parts of the project. Okay, so normal process in terms of defining the risk factors and then using those risk factors to categorize each line item on the estimate. And there you can see I used a Vos-PERT alt in this case, where I had 3 categories in terms of cost uncertainty, where I have database pricing, which is my lowest level of certainty. Then I have market pricing, where you went out into the market and you asked people for pricing. And then also the best category is I already have a vendor pricing, where I have in the process of placing the order. So you will see that the range between each of those categories, the range becomes narrower. The range on the top one is 0.2, and on the other one is 0.04. And then you do the same thing for the level of engineering. And I'm not going to have any discussions because someone will ask me, where do I get these numbers from? It normally comes from engineering judgment or previous projects. These are just examples. So please, as I tell my students, don't tell people that database pricing sits between 0.96 and 1.16. This is just an example. Okay. And something that's important is in these models, I prefer to use models with a longer tail to the right-hand side. As you can see there in the distribution. And the reason for that is to make provision for shootouts on pricing. Okay, so bill of quantities, and we've categorized all the different all the line items in the bill of quantities according to the level of engineering as well as the cost categories. Okay, basic use of the risk factor method. Okay, now the results, and I'll show you the Excel later on. So when I run the model, I get a nice little table where I can see what my minimum, my maximum, and all these different confidence intervals are. I use the function here Vos sim result, and the P50 was in this case was 29,942, and then the contingency amount is simply my base price, which I then subtracted from that amount, and my contingency for that is 2,119, which gives me a 7.62 percentage points contingency. Okay, just straightforward histogram here at the bottom. The same data. You can see on the left-hand side as well, our deterministic cost of the project was 27,822, and that sits on the P2 of the output. So which means that there's only a 2% chance that our project would come in at lower than the deterministic estimate of the project. Okay, so and then on the right-hand side, you see the tornado graph. And in this case, the tornado graph tells us that the most uncertainty sits in vendor package number 3. And that's already really good example, good information, because that tells us that if we want to reduce uncertainty on the project, we need to start with vendor package number 3 and then vendor package number 5. What you can also see from this graph is that our time variable cost is on the lower part of the tornado graph, which means that our project and uncertainty on the project is more influenced by direct cost than indirect cost, which doesn't mean that you should neglect your schedule and managing the schedule and the schedule simulation parts of that. It just tells us that if you want to reduce uncertainty on the project, it does not sit in the schedule for now. It sits in the direct cost. It sits in the bill of quantities. Okay. So next screen. Results. So I spoke about this before. It's good for the client to know a 2% chance of the project coming in under budget if they don't add any contingency to it. What they can also do is they can take a look at and see at historical projects, which the model simulates a 14.83 percentage points contingency. How does that align with previous history on similar project, if that history exists? And then also you can see there is a tail to the right, which means that there is if things go wrong, it shows what the maximum cost of the project can be, and it's nearly 36,000, where we have a base price of 27,000. So it's nearly it's a third higher than the base price. So if it shoots out, we're gonna have problems. And that's just some of the high-level interpretation that one can have of these graphs. There are obviously a lot more that one can get out of this. That's our standard functions that sits inside inside the model risk, but this is the high-level overview to keep it simple. Okay, so what this also tells us that we can increase design maturity for package 3 to reduce the uncertainty there, and we can also then take a look at what can we do to increase estimate accuracy, and then also investigate what drives the scope and what drives uncertainty in the scope. So it's already good information which management can use. Okay, so now unexpected results. So what I have here is what do you do? And this is the question that I had, that was the whole discussion was about. What do you do if you get a tornado graph that looks like this? And I'll show you now why one gets tornado graphs like this, but it tells me really nothing except that uncertainty is the same for all the packages, and that direct cost is the main driver of uncertainty in the project. But it doesn't help me to understand where I need to start looking if I want to start interrogating the various packages in the bill of quantities. And I'll take you now through how I built that model. So I called it an uncertainty matrix, and simply because I didn't have another word for it. But it talks about uncertainty, and I like the word matrix, so and it looks like a matrix, so that's why I called it that. And the basic principle is the following. So let me make sure, can you still hear me? Making sure. Okay, cool. So, and I'll show you the Excel now. So what you see on the screen is the package descriptions, and then the deterministic totals of each of the packages, and I use for that again a SUMIFS function. Then you'll see the total variance, and I use the variance example. This is my internal terminology. That is a SUMIF function that comes from my bill of quantities for package 1. So it tells me, give me all the simulated results, add them up for package 1, package 2, etc., etc., etc. And for this iteration, I got a total of 30,616. Now, as I move towards the right, every time I go, if I go to the EPCM block, you'll see in there that what's in blue now is the deterministic value. It is not the simulated value. So what that means is that if I take a look at that column that says EPCM, it is all the packages that I simulate except EPCM cost. Okay, which means that if I get the P90 for the total and I get the P90 for the EPCM cost, I can subtract those two from each other and determine what the difference is between those two columns. And as I move towards the right, for every time I go to another column, I remove the uncertainty that talks to that item. So for owner's team, I remove owner's team and EPCM. Package 5, I remove package 5, owner's team and EPCM, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. So by the time I get to package 1, you'll see it's exactly the same thing as the deterministic columns. And what makes this useful is I can now determine for each of those, I can take the P80 or the P90 or whatever I choose, and I can subtract them from each other and see what the difference is between package 5 and package 4. Which means that I will then know what the contingency is that must go to that package. Okay, and I'll show you the Excel now. And the outcome of this is that I can then calculate using simple mathematics how much contingency I need to allocate to package 1. And then I can see that package 3 is the most requires the most contingency. So therefore, I will know that if I want to start looking at where uncertainty sits, I have a defendable position in stating that if I do this and apply this type of method, the most contingency is required by package 3, which tells me then I then know where I need to go and look, and I can defend that position. I can, of course, could have said that, you know, the most money, package 1 has the highest cost, so therefore it has to get the most contingency. But that is a value judgment and not something that's based on any simulation. Okay, and what makes this useful is I now can defend my position in terms of how much contingency goes to which package based on the current assumptions that sits inside the model. Okay, and I'm going to show you the Excel now. Give me a moment. Okay, just making sure. Can somebody just tell me, can you see the Excel? Can you see the Excel? I mustn't do that.
No, mustn't do that.
You can't see that. Okay, cool. So,
yeah.
So what I did is I built 2 models. So there's the one that I showed you first. And you'll see in the no variance model where I get a tornado graph that doesn't do anything, all those cost uncertainty categories are exactly the same. And that normally happens when you are in a project which is early in the project life cycle, you're in pre-concept phase, and you don't know anything, you have low certainty regarding cost and low certainty on the level of engineering. Okay, so that is normally, in my experience, not normally, it's always the reason why in all the cases I've had is they have a tornado graph that cannot tell you where the uncertainty sits. Okay, there's the risk factor table that I showed you before. And then this is a very useful function. If you go into model risk and you go to your results and you say view your results, you can create linked charts. It's very useful. You create the chart, and when you change the data, it updates automatically. It's really it's a functionality which I use in all my models. Okay, so now this is how the model works in terms of the Excel that sits inside the matrix. So you'll see that if I press F9, which iterates between different, it's with my sample, you'll see that the parts that are in blue has no uncertainty attached to it. It is the deterministic value that sits in there. So this means that if I get a P90 for that example, that one, and I compare it to the EPCM value, I can then, after I run the simulation, I can see where the contingency percentage sits. And based on that, I can use simple math, and I'll send out the model afterwards. I'm not going to go into the Excel in here, but you can see it's really simple math to estimate how much contingency goes into each of these packages. And to repeat that, it's basically the difference between those 2 P90 values. I use that to determine the amount of contingency that goes into that specific package. Okay, it's really simple math. What makes it very useful is that it is the math. It's the model. It tells you what it is. It's a very defendable position. And then in the end, I can tell my client, dear client, that is what the model looks like. That's a deterministic cost. There's the amount of uncertainty, the contingency that I have. And I can then tell them, they can do a little sum. I can tell them of that contingency, the 8% of the overall contingency goes to package 1, and I can then do it like that. And that should add up to 100%. So I can then, in this way, have a defendable position to use a simulation model to estimate how much contingency goes into each package. Why this is useful, I'm going back to my Excel bit, is when you take a look at the histogram, a simulation answers the question about how much contingency we need, but it does not tell me where the contingency sits in the work breakdown structure. And this matrix, I call an uncertainty matrix, provides a practical method to allocate contingency towards packages. And it also tells you where the uncertainty sits, because contingency is there's a direct relation between that. It's practical for cost engineers, for QRA practitioners, and for project controls to have a defendable position where that contingency comes from, specifically in the case of where you don't know the uncertainty sits in the model. And the last question here, it shows where contingency sits, which then can help you in decision making. And that is me done for my presentation. I'll now gladly take questions. Okay.
Anyway, yes, thank you very much, Francois, for that insightful presentation. We will now have a few minutes for questions. If you have a question, please enter it in the chat. I'll select a few that come in. Got my chat here. All right.
Any questions?
We've got. Let's see. I see where folks saw your presentation. They said yes. Well, folks, where you type that in, please feel free to type in a few questions for us.
Quentin, ask me a difficult question, please.
Yes.
Okay. So just on these types of models, when you build them, as I said, using named ranges is a good it helps simplify models. It helps you also when you need to explain, when you need to understand your model after you haven't used it for a while. And then also the use of SUMIFs functions really makes this easy in terms of adding things up which belong together. One must just be very careful in this case that when you use those named ranges, that the named ranges have the same size, because as I said, otherwise your model will fall over and you will have to do a lot of swearing before you found out that it's your own fault in terms of not defining the named ranges properly in the model.
I have one question, okay. Francois. I have one question. Yes. This is Gustavo, and I imagine that everybody can hear me. So, oh well, we have one question from
one
Willie.
Came in too.
Okay.
No, go ahead, please, James. You can read it out, and then I have one.
Did the use of risk factors and sum fits, etc., mean you don't need rank order correlation? Thanks.
Okay. Now, I'll have to go back into the help function to answer that question. But one of the advantages of the risk factor method is that it already brings correlation into the model, because you correlate different parts of the model with each other. It is very similar to the categories, and if you use Tamara on work type categories, which automatically brings correlation into the model, even if you don't use specific correlation matrices and things like that. So yes, it brings correlation into the model. It's just that I didn't use correlation matrices as it is set up in model risk. Okay, you're welcome, Willie. Do you use a preference for PERT or triangular distribution? So first of all, I never use triangular distribution, and there's a whole discussion regarding what you should use. I normally use log normal, specifically if there's a log normal alt. That's what I normally use. I just use, in this case, I use PERT alt because it's easy to understand as well. And for PERT alt, you can give it a tail to the right-hand side as well. The other one which I use if you are early in the project lifecycle and there's a lot of uncertainty is just the normal uniform distribution. So those are the ones that I use most is log normal and PERT alt. And then if you are very early in the project lifecycle and there's no central tendency in the distributions, I use always uniform distribution. Answer your question.
Thank you.
So my preference is I never use triangular. I use PERT alt, or log normal. Okay. Thanks, Bruce. And that's also what I teach people. It's just. And the thing is as well is I'm going to talk something about something which I used before in this model itself. The question of when you use these risk factors, do you go below 1 in terms of cost? And what I mean with that is if you take a look at the, let me share my screen with you again. If I share my screen, it's an interesting concept if you do this. So it talks about if you use risk factors and you use those things, do you go below 1 or not? Quentin and I had long discussions about this, and he just laughed and he said, "Ha, ha, ha. Have you ever seen a project coming in under cost?" No, I haven't. Except in the cases where scope was removed, then it still came out at the original price with the scope removed. So that's what I use. That's normally what I use on that, is something as close as 1 as possible, because based on the context of where we execute projects in South Africa. Okay. The thing is, on triangular, if you use data from real life projects, you never see a triangular distribution. That's why I never use it. Is that I never see something. If you take a look at data or project data in terms of project cost overruns and things like that, you never see from real data a triangular distribution, unless I've not seen it before. But it always looks like something with a long tail towards the right. So that's why I use log normal distribution. Okay, does that answer your question? Joachim Schulte. Joachim, are you German? Okay, so that is a very difficult question. Isn't the choice of distribution completely secondary to the choice of the right correlation between cost drivers? I'm going to ask for help on this one, Gustavo. Can you give me a bit of help on that one? Joachim asked, isn't the choice of distribution completely secondary? And I'll stop sharing my screen, sorry. Completely secondary to the choice of the right correlation between cost drivers. I've never seen that question before. It's a really good question. I cannot answer that. I'll have to get back to you on that, Joachim. Shoot me a light, but I don't have a straight answer for you on that. I'll get back to you on that, unless one of my colleagues would like to answer that question.
Yeah, let me see. Isn't the choice of distribution completely secondary to the choice of the right? I think so. I mean, to the choice of isn't the choice of the distribution completely secondary to the choice of the right correlation? So that gives the correlation the pecking order, right? That makes it a little bit more important, yes. The correlation to the distribution. I would normally do the opposite, right? I would normally try to profile the variable with the right distribution, and the correlation I calculate it if I have historical information. It is a cost driver. Normally with cost, you would have that. So that will be my answer. But it's a really good one. I've never, as you, Francois, is the first time I see it. So maybe we can talk with, we can maybe do a presentation with Joachim as well. It's a really good one. Yeah. And I think that we have another one, Francois. And thanks everybody for the question. It's how could you estimate the time contingency?
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So, Nasser. So if you want to do that, and that's why I explicitly stated that I did not use Tamara in this example. How you would do that in Tamara is you would build your schedule in Tamara, you do your schedule simulation in Tamara, and you would export via the SID function, you would export your output distribution of the various parts of the schedule into Excel, into model risk, and then you would model the time variable cost in there like that. So that's why, yes, that's the whole purpose. Now, in the last two webinars back, I spoke about that. But that's the task of Tamara. I just kept it simple here because I wanted to keep it simple on the one hand, and also show that the method you have you can apply without using Tamara. But if you need Tamara, you obviously should use it. So that's my answer on that one. Okay, Joachim, your answer is 100% correct. We tend to talk a lot more regarding the distribution choice than talking about correlation. It is one of those things because correlation is a very difficult thing to talk about. And Gustavo, maybe we should for the next one have a discussion on how to answer that question of Joachim. As they say auf Deutsch, ist eine richtig gute Frage, aber ich habe keine Antwort dafür. Yes. So next time we'll get an answer for you on that. But it's a really good answer. A really good question. Thanks for that. Any other questions for me?
I was going to make one, but I think that Nasser already made the question I was going to pose. So for me, it's fine. Thank you. Thank you, Francois.
Okay. So just one thing from my side. I'll forward the model to as the model sits. Yeah, somebody once said I speak German with a Dutch accent because I learned the Dutch Bavarian accent because I learned Deutsch in München. So just on the model, I will forward a copy to the model to Gustavo, which I don't know how they distribute the model. It's straightforward. But as with all these models, you can't cut and paste the model. You have to use that and build your own model. Okay, cool. Any last questions for me? Then again, to the Fairyfield team, thanks very much for having me. I really enjoyed doing these things, and sorry for my dog. My dog was a bit underneath the table while I was doing the presentation, so sorry for that. She weighs 60 kilograms, so she gets quite persistent. So thank you very much for having me, and if there are any more questions, please just let me know. The presentation will also be uploaded, and my contact details are on the presentation. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was great.